It was a routine morning in Clayton, Missouri. The November air was crisp, the streets quiet, and the sun rising over a neighborhood that had always felt safe. At approximately 7 a.m., that sense of security was shattered. Michelle Hampton, a young mother, stepped outside her home to see her twin sister Samantha and her nephews. A yellow Ram truck pulled up abruptly. Before anyone could react, a man emerged, armed with a handgun. The man wasn't a stranger. Samantha recognized him immediately, her boyfriend, Mosby. His presence with a weapon in hand was shocking enough, but what followed was beyond comprehension. Mosby approached Michelle with urgency, his gun pointed directly at her. Samantha's protests filled the air, but her voice did nothing to deter him. He grabbed Michelle and forced her into the truck. She didn't scream, her wide eyes and trembling hands spoke louder than words. The door slammed shut and the truck sped off, leaving Samantha frozen for a moment before she sprang into action. Samantha leapt into her own car, her nephews in the back seat, and pursued the yellow truck. Her heart raced as she struggled to keep up. The truck weaved through traffic, taking sharp turns and speeding down the narrow streets of St. Louis. Samantha remained focused, her fear for her sister outweighing any concern for her own safety. The chase came to a sudden and terrifying halt when gunfire erupted from the truck. A bullet ricocheted off her car's hood, forcing Samantha to slam on the brakes. Her nephews screamed in the back seat as she pulled over to safety. Samantha dialed 911 with shaking hands, the operator barely able to understand her frantic words. She provided the truck's description and begged for help, but the vehicle had already disappeared from sight. Meanwhile, Michelle's ordeal had taken a chilling turn. Mosby and his accomplice, Suarez, drove her to multiple banks across St. Louis, forcing her to withdraw cash. Surveillance footage captured her sitting in the back seat of the truck, her expression a mix of fear and resignation. She complied with their every demand, hoping that cooperation might spare her life. At one bank, Michelle attempted to withdraw $10,000. The teller informed her she could only take out $2,000. Her captors grew increasingly agitated. When another bank employee suggested Michelle come inside to complete a transaction, the truck sped off. The suspects weren't ready to risk further exposure. While Michelle navigated the nightmare of being used as a pawn, Samantha was working with law enforcement. Using the Life 360 app on her phone, she tracked Michelle's location and relayed updates to the police. Officers rushed to the coordinates she provided, but by the time they arrived, all they found was Michelle's discarded phone. The trail had gone cold. Hours passed. It wasn't until 11 a.m. that police received a chilling call about gunfire on the northwest side of St. Louis. Responding officers found a shell casing and a crumpled bank receipt in an alley. Nearby, they discovered Michelle's lifeless body. She had been shot 5 times in the head. The brutality of the crime was evident. This was no robbery gone wrong. It was a calculated execution. Standing over Michelle's body, I couldn't shake the weight of what had just unfolded. The alley was quiet, save for the murmurs of officers documenting the scene and the hum of police radios. Evidence markers dotted the ground, each one telling a piece of the story: a shell casing here, blood spatter there. This wasn't just another case. This was personal, deliberate, and vicious. As we processed the scene, the bank receipt and shell casing became critical clues. The details began to form a grim narrative. Someone wanted Michelle's money, but they also wanted to silence her forever. The investigation would uncover the full story, but standing in that alley, I already knew one thing. This was a betrayal of the deepest kind. The notification of Michelle Hampton's death tore through her family like a thunderclap. Samantha, still shaken from the morning's events, collapsed in disbelief when officers delivered the news. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of the abduction, every sharp turn during the pursuit, and the deafening sound of gunfire. She had failed to save her sister, and the weight of that failure crushed her. The family gathered at Samantha's home, a place that now felt hollow without Michelle's vibrant presence. Michelle's mother clutched a framed photograph of her daughter, her sobs breaking the silence. "She didn't deserve this," she whispered through her tears. None of this makes sense. Michelle's young son clung to his grandmother, too young to grasp the magnitude of what had happened, but old enough to sense the devastation in the room. News of Michelle's murder spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Neighbors, friends, and co-workers expressed disbelief. A young mother, taken in broad daylight and executed so brutally, was a crime that defied comprehension. People left flowers and candles on the sidewalk outside her home, a growing memorial that reflected the love the community had for Michelle. Notes with messages like "Gone too soon" and "Justice for Michelle" were tucked among the tributes. Samantha's grief turned into guilt, an unrelenting voice in her mind telling her that she should have done more. She replayed the chase in her head over and over. If only I'd called 911 sooner. If only I'd driven faster. If only I hadn't stopped when they shot at me. The rational voices of her family and friends, reassuring her that she'd done everything she could, barely registered. "I let her down," she told me during one of our interviews. "She was my twin. I was supposed to protect her." The autopsy report provided by the medical examiner only deepened the family's anguish. Michelle's cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds to the head, 5 to be exact. Each shot was another piece of evidence pointing to the cold calculation of her killers. It wasn't just a robbery. It wasn't just an impulsive act. It was an execution. In the days following her death, Michelle's family faced the agonizing task of planning her funeral. They chose a photo of Michelle holding her young son, her smile bright and full of life, for the program. Friends and relatives came from across the city to pay their respects. Samantha stood near the casket, her hand resting on the edge as if to anchor herself. "She was my other half," she told one visitor. "Now I don't know how to go on." The community rallied around the family, offering meals, donations, and support. But their kindness couldn't fill the void left by Michelle's absence. Her son, now a toddler, wandered the house calling for his mother. Her parents avoided going into Michelle's room, unable to face the sight of her belongings. Samantha, too, avoided the room. Every time she caught a glimpse of Michelle's neatly made bed or her favorite sweater draped over a chair, the pain of loss hit her anew. The broader public reaction was no less intense. News outlets covered the story extensively, with headlines like "A Twin Betrayed," "The Tragic Death of Michelle Hampton." Social media was ablaze with outrage, with strangers expressing solidarity and sorrow for a family they'd never met. Hashtags like "Justice for Michelle" and "Stop the Violence" trended for days. Vigils were held not just in Clayton but in surrounding areas as people sought to honor Michelle's memory and demand justice. Amid the grief and outrage, questions loomed. How could this have happened? Why hadn't Michelle been protected? And what kind of person could commit such a heinous act against someone they knew, someone they were connected to through family? For Samantha, those questions were knives twisting in an already gaping wound. She had trusted Mosby. He had been in her home, shared meals with her family, and played with her nephews. To think that he could betray that trust so violently was unfathomable. "He didn't just take Michelle," she said. "He took a part of all of us." As an investigator, I've seen the aftermath of many crimes, but this one was different. The depth of the family's grief, the profound sense of betrayal, and the brutal nature of the crime made it a case that stayed with me even after I left their home. I couldn't help but think of Samantha and her unbearable guilt. The reality was that no amount of reassurance or justice could ever truly heal the wounds left by that morning. The funeral came and went, but the pain lingered. Michelle's family resolved to see the case through, determined to honor her memory by seeking justice. They attended every court hearing, every meeting with prosecutors, their grief fueling their resolve. Samantha, though haunted by her guilt, vowed to ensure that Michelle's story would not be forgotten. As the investigation progressed, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. The yellow truck speeding away, the look of terror on Samantha's face as she recounted the events, and the chilling scene in the alley where Michelle's life had been cut short. It wasn't just a case, it was a tragedy that demanded answers, accountability, and, most of all, justice. The investigation into Michelle Hampton's murder began the moment officers arrived at the crime scene. The alley where her body was found was desolate, littered with evidence that painted a gruesome picture of her final moments. A .40 caliber shell casing glinted under the midday sun, lying just feet away from a crumpled bank withdrawal receipt. These pieces were more than just objects, they were fragments of a horrifying narrative. The first breakthrough came from Michelle's twin sister, Samantha. When officers questioned her, Samantha was distraught but resolute. Through tears, she named her boyfriend, Mosby, as the primary suspect. "It was him," she said. "I saw him take her. He was driving the truck." Her testimony was corroborated by her nephews, who had also witnessed the abduction. Their young voices trembled as they recounted the terrifying moments. Samantha also revealed a critical detail. Michelle had recently come into $40,000 from a settlement. Days earlier, she had shared this information with Mosby, a detail that now loomed large as a possible motive. It was a lead investigators couldn't ignore. The search for the yellow Ram truck began immediately. Officers issued a bolo, be on the lookout, alert, and within hours, the vehicle was located abandoned in the garage of a vacant home. The truck was a treasure trove of evidence. Inside, investigators found an empty bank envelope bearing Michelle's name, as well as another withdrawal slip. In a nearby dumpster, they discovered a hoodie seen in the surveillance footage from the banks. DNA analysis would later confirm that the hoodie belonged to Mosby. Detectives also uncovered the truck's history. It had been reported stolen weeks earlier. This discovery suggested a premeditated crime, with the stolen vehicle used to obscure the suspects' identities. But Mosby's connection to the family and Samantha's immediate identification of him as the perpetrator made it clear this wasn't a random act of violence. The surveillance footage from the bank solidified the timeline. Michelle could be seen in the back seat of the truck, visibly distressed, while Mosby and his accomplice, later identified as Mosby Suarez, coerced her into withdrawing money. The footage provided damning evidence of their involvement and showcased the methodical nature of their crime. Mosby was the first to be apprehended. Officers tracked him down after a brief pursuit, during which he attempted to evade capture. When he was finally cornered, a search of his vehicle revealed two critical pieces of evidence: his phone and a handgun. Ballistics testing would later confirm that the gun matched the shell casing found at the scene of Michelle's murder. During his interrogation, Mosby confessed to several elements of the crime. He admitted to kidnapping Michelle and forcing her to withdraw money. He also admitted to firing shots at Samantha's car during the pursuit. But when questioned about Michelle's death, his tone shifted. He claimed that he had given her a chance to run before pulling the trigger. It was a chilling admission, one that revealed his twisted sense of justification. "She could have run," he said flatly, as if that absolved him of responsibility. The second suspect, Mosby Suarez, was arrested days later. Surveillance footage had captured him driving the stolen truck before, and DNA evidence from the hoodie linked him to the crime. Like Mosby, Suarez attempted to flee when officers approached him, but he was quickly subdued. His role in the crime became clear during questioning. He was the accomplice who had helped Mosby plan and execute the abduction. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, the motive became undeniable. Mosby had targeted Michelle because of the $40,000 settlement. His desperation for money had driven him to commit an unthinkable act, dragging Suarez into his plans. The pair's lack of foresight, however, left a trail of evidence so incriminating that their guilt was impossible to deny. The prosecution began building its case, relying heavily on the mountain of evidence collected by investigators. The surveillance footage, the DNA from the hoodie, the forensic analysis of the gun, and Mosby's own confession painted a damning picture. The motive was clear: greed. The method was ruthless: abduction, coercion, and execution. And the betrayal was personal, cutting to the core of Michelle's family. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Mosby pleaded not guilty, as did Suarez. Their defense attorney sought to poke holes in the investigation, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial and that the confessions were coerced. But their arguments held little weight against the sheer volume of evidence. For investigators, the case was a grim reminder of the depths to which human desperation and betrayal could sink. Michelle's murder wasn't just a crime, it was a deliberate, calculated act that shattered the lives of those who loved her. Every piece of evidence collected, every witness statement taken, and every hour spent piecing together the timeline was a step toward ensuring that justice would be served. As the suspects awaited trial, the community held its breath. The wheels of justice were turning, but for Michelle's family, the wait was excruciating. Samantha, haunted by guilt and grief, attended every hearing, her presence a testament to her determination to see the process through. For the investigators, this case wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about honoring Michelle's life and ensuring that her killers would face the full weight of the law. Michelle Hampton's murder sent shockwaves far beyond the confines of her family in Clayton, Missouri. The brazenness of the crime, the calculated betrayal, and the senseless violence ignited a firestorm of outrage across the community and the nation. People struggled to make sense of a tragedy that seemed ripped from the pages of a harrowing novel. Michelle was not just another victim, she was a young mother, a sister, and a vibrant member of her community. The revelation that her own twin sister's boyfriend had orchestrated her abduction and murder was a betrayal that cut deeper than most could comprehend. For Clayton's residents, the crime shattered the illusion of safety they had long cherished. Parents who once felt secure walking their children to school now looked over their shoulders. The tragedy reminded everyone that evil could strike even in the most familiar places. Vigils for Michelle sprang up across the city, candlelight illuminated faces filled with grief and anger. At one gathering, Samantha stood before the crowd, her voice trembling as she spoke. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she said, clutching a framed photo of her sister. Michelle had her whole life ahead of her. She had her son to raise, her dreams to fulfill. And it was stolen from her for what? Money. Her words echoed the sentiment of the community: anger at the senselessness, disbelief at the betrayal, and sorrow for a life cut short. Social media became a platform for mourning and activism. The hashtag Justice for Michelle trended nationwide, with people sharing their outrage and demanding accountability. Strangers who had never met Michelle posted heartfelt tributes, calling for an end to the greed and violence that had claimed her life. Advocacy groups used the moment to highlight the dangers of financial exploitation and domestic violence, rallying support for stronger protections. The betrayal aspect of the crime struck a particularly deep chord. Michelle had trusted Mosby, as had Samantha. To think that someone so close to the family could commit such an atrocity was incomprehensible to many. It reignited conversations about trust, manipulation, and the hidden dangers lurking within personal relationships. Community leaders held town hall meetings, inviting counselors and legal experts to discuss ways to identify warning signs and prevent such tragedies in the future. The case also drew national attention to the issue of financial exploitation, particularly in cases involving women. Michelle's $40,000 settlement, meant to improve her life and that of her son, had become the motive for her murder. Advocacy organizations seized on the story to push for stronger financial protections for vulnerable individuals, especially women and single mothers. The narrative became a rallying cry: no one should lose their life because of another's greed. Criticism of law enforcement's response added another layer to the public discourse. Some questioned whether more could have been done during the crucial hours after Michelle's abduction. While police eventually tracked down the yellow truck and arrested the suspects, critics argued that a faster response might have saved Michelle's life. The St. Louis Police Department promised a thorough review of its procedures, vowing to identify and address any shortcomings. The systemic issues highlighted by Michelle's murder extended to broader societal problems. Advocates pointed to the crime as an example of how financial desperation and unchecked violence often intersect. Calls for stricter gun control measures intensified, with many arguing that the accessibility of firearms had made it far too easy for Mosby and Suarez to carry out their crime. Others demanded harsher penalties for those who exploit or harm vulnerable individuals, pushing for legislative change. Michelle's murder also sparked debates about the justice system. Critics questioned how someone like Mosby, with his history of manipulation and greed, could operate unchecked. Discussions about preemptive measures, such as closer monitoring of individuals with known violent tendencies, gained momentum. The community's outrage fueled these debates, with many demanding answers and action. At the heart of the societal response, however, was Michelle's family. Their grief became a focal point for the public's emotions. Samantha's guilt, Michelle's son's confusion, and their parents' heartbreak resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. Their willingness to share their pain and fight for justice inspired countless others to speak out against violence and betrayal. The community rallied around the family, raising funds to support Michelle's son and cover funeral expenses. Volunteers organized events to honor Michelle's memory, from charity runs to fundraisers benefiting organizations that help victims of violence. The tragedy became a catalyst for collective action, uniting people in their determination to prevent similar horrors. For investigators, the public outcry underscored the importance of securing justice for Michelle. The weight of societal expectations added urgency to their work, driving them to ensure that every piece of evidence was airtight and every aspect of the case was thoroughly addressed. The crime had become more than a legal matter. It was a moral imperative, a chance to restore some semblance of order to a world that had been upended by senseless violence. As Michelle's family braced for the trials ahead, they found solace in the community's support. Strangers became allies, their voices joining the call for justice. The tragedy had left an indelible mark, but it also spurred a movement, a collective resolve to confront the darkness that had claimed Michelle and ensure that her death would not be in vain. The courtroom was heavy with tension as the trial for Michelle Hampton's murder began. For her family, the proceedings were both a grim reminder of their loss and a crucial step toward justice. Samantha sat in the front row, her eyes fixed on the accused, her former boyfriend, Mosby, and his accomplice, Suarez. The betrayal that had shattered her world was now laid bare for all to see. The prosecution wasted no time presenting its case, laying out a compelling narrative of greed, betrayal, and cold-blooded violence. Surveillance footage from the banks where Michelle was forced to withdraw money was shown, each frame a haunting reminder of her final hours. Witnesses testified about the truck's erratic movements, the chilling car chase, and the final gunshots that ended Michelle's life. Forensic experts provided irrefutable evidence. Ballistic tests confirmed that the .40 caliber gun found in Mosby's possession matched the shell casing at the crime scene. DNA from the hoodie recovered in the dumpster near the stolen truck linked both Mosby and Suarez to the crime. Michelle's withdrawal slips and the bank envelope found in the truck's interior left no doubt about their involvement. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of the crime. Mosby and Suarez had meticulously planned their actions, from stealing the truck weeks prior to targeting Michelle for her $40,000 settlement. The evidence painted a chilling picture of a crime driven by greed, executed with ruthless efficiency. Mosby's defense attempted to cast doubt, arguing that his confession was coerced and that his involvement was exaggerated. Suarez's attorneys claimed he was merely an unwitting accomplice. But the overwhelming evidence, combined with Mosby's own admission that he had given Michelle a chance to run before shooting her, left little room for doubt. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground of emotions. Michelle's family, visibly shaken, endured graphic descriptions of her final moments. Samantha struggled to hold back tears as prosecutors detailed how Mosby, the man she had trusted, had betrayed her and her sister so completely. The defense's attempts to deflect blame only deepened the family's pain, as they were forced to relive the worst day of their lives again and again. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the verdicts were unanimous: guilty. Mosby and Suarez were convicted on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and additional counts related to the abduction and killing. The sentences were swift and severe. Mosby received life without parole, while Suarez, though spared the same fate due to a plea agreement, faced decades behind bars. Outside the courtroom, Samantha spoke briefly to reporters. "Justice was served today," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "But it doesn't bring my sister back. It doesn't heal the pain. We'll never forget what they took from us." The community that had rallied around the Hampton family celebrated the verdicts as a victory for justice. Vigils were held to honor Michelle's memory, and her family announced plans to establish a scholarship fund in her name to support single mothers pursuing higher education. It was a way to ensure that Michelle's legacy would live on, even in the face of such tragedy. For investigators, the convictions were a testament to the meticulous work that had gone into the case. The evidence had been undeniable, the suspect's guilt clear, yet the emotional toll of the case lingered. Michelle's murder was a stark reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of unchecked greed. As the family and community began to heal, they vowed to use Michelle's story as a beacon for change. Advocacy efforts to support victims of financial exploitation and violence gained momentum, fueled by the tragedy that had unfolded in Clayton. While the pain of Michelle's loss would never fully fade, her memory became a catalyst for action, a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable grief. Michelle Hampton's life was cut short by betrayal and violence, but her legacy would endure through the lives she inspired, the family she loved, and the justice that was finally achieved in her name.